The Crimea crisis has been described as the most dangerous superpower flashpoint since the end of the Cold War. It has pitted the West against Russia, Putin against Obama. After the pro-Russian Yanukovych government was overthrown in Kiev after months of street protests, the European Union and the United States could hardly contain their delight.
The Western-backed coup in Kiev was what pushed Crimea to join Russia. They would have come after us next, so we had to protect ourselves.
But fearing that the West would try to establish military bases in Ukraine, Russia immediately struck back by annexing Crimea, to the joy of most of the region's residents.
This is definitely a conflict between America and Russia. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia went through a crisis and the people experienced very difficult living conditions. But after Putin came to power, the country got stronger. Even the international media now consider him the #1 politician in the whole world.
This week's In Focus comes to you from Crimea. Has Russia checkmated the West by annexing this strategic peninsula? Will Putin move his troops into eastern Ukraine? And how will the West respond to implement its strategy of surrounding and containing Russia? If the now Russian region of Crimea is at the center of a geopolitical struggle between East and West, the city of Sevastopol symbolizes that struggle. Located on the Black Sea, the Russian military has long maintained de facto control over this busy port, which has long been coveted by those wanting to attack as well as defend Russia.
Sevastopol city is around 230 years old, and because of this prime geographical location, it's been besieged twice in its history, once during the Crimean War and then again during the Second World War. And now again, it's at the center of a geopolitical struggle. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, as you can see behind me, is based here, and in recent weeks, the Russian Navy has been conducting far more training exercises.
The Black Sea Fleet has seen action against the Ottoman Empire, as well as during World War II, and most recently during the 2008 South Ossetia War. It consists of around 40 ships, including assault frigates, submarines and minesweepers. When Crimea was part of Ukraine, nationalists repeatedly pointed out that the Black Sea Fleet was an agent of instability that facilitated separatism. And although it's a moot point now, the extension of the Black Sea Fleet lease was always controversial.
The people of Sevastopol are really proud of their history, and here in the center of the town we have a statue to Pavel Nahimov, the defender of Sevastopol during the Crimean War in the 19th century. And in the 21st century, it's Mother Russia that the people of this city look to for protection.
За всех сказать не могу, но большинство людей, которых я знаю, однозначно.
There are so many pro-Russian people here in Sevastopol because of the city's history. This is known as the Fortress of Russia because so many people died defending it. Other towns in Crimea are more mixed, but 90% of the people are pro-Russian here.
Since the early time of history of Sevastopol, here we have the Russian people, Russian ideology, connection with Russia, and they want us to forget our roots, to forget our two defenses.
Want to say to all over the world, we love Russia. We are Russian and Russian-speaking people. We want to live here in Sevastopol and our Crimea, and we want to be with Russia.
We visited Sevastopol a few days before the March 16th referendum in Crimea, which saw the peninsula vote to join Russia. Other areas of Crimea have their fair share of anti-Russian opinion, but Sevastopol is staunchly pro-Russian. Perhaps this is a legacy of the heroic, bloody, and ultimately successful sieges that devastated this city twice. Although that didn't stop several arguments breaking out in the central square.
We all know that America wants to dominate the whole world, so for us in Crimea, we definitely need Russia's protection. Kiev caused this crisis by allowing a coup to take place, so now we have to protect ourselves against the fascists.
I think all this madness was planned. I just watch the TV every night and cry. I can't believe what's happening. I'm not a nationalist, and I just think that Russians and Ukrainians should live together in peace. What's the point of this referendum? I'm going to boycott it.
With all these politicians in Kiev, and with coming of Nazi, and we call them Nazi because they have already ruined their own Kiev, our capital, and western parts of Ukraine, and now they're coming and threatening us.
As we drove out of Sevastopol, we saw several Russian military vehicles en route. Pro-Russian defense forces had also erected makeshift checkpoints to stop so-called troublemakers from entering the city. We also heard reports of journalists getting stopped. It seemed like the Russians were determined to stop anybody or anything from ruining the referendum. Not only were the Russians being careful about internal movement within Crimea, but they were restricting access to the outside world as well. We were due to fly to Kiev a few days before the March 16th referendum to film with pro-Western, anti-Russian groups there, but we simply couldn't get out.
Now, we were supposed to fly out of this very same airport today to Kiev, but our flight was cancelled. All internal flights outside of Crimea into Ukraine have been cancelled, and only flights to Moscow are still operating. Now, I'm not sure what's going on, but it does seem the Russians may be trying to impose some kind of blockade going in from Crimea and out of Crimea so that no one can disrupt the referendum due to take place on March the 16th.
Despite the lack of traffic at the airport, the local media was there in force to greet a famous exile returning to his homeland. The first president of Crimea, who'd spent years in Moscow after Ukrainian independence in the 90s, was overjoyed that the peninsula would be returning to Russia.
I have just been to Kiev, and all I found there was bandits and traitors. So I've come back to Crimea to help with the referendum, and I will vote to join Russia. Long live the Republic of Crimea.
Да здравствует Республика Крым!
So the Russians, or at least their allies in Crimea, were solidifying their control on the ground. They had bolstered their naval battleships in Sevastopol, and now they were in control of the main regional airport. Facts on the ground were fast being established.
This is the famous Livadia Palace where Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin met at the end of the Second World War for the Yalta Conference. And it was Stalin who effectively bullied the other two world leaders into acceding to his demands to dominate Eastern Europe. And why did they have to do that? Because Stalin and the Red Army had the strategic advantage on the ground, a bit like Putin has today in Crimea.
The Russian royal family used to holiday here in Yalta, and that's why waxwork models of them are exhibited in this palace. They were executed by the communists at the end of the First World War, but they've since been rehabilitated and now are even revered as saints. But most people come here to see the waxworks of the three great warlords, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill. The symbolism resonates even today. Stalin as Putin, Roosevelt as Obama, and Churchill as the European Union.
This is definitely a conflict between America and Russia. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia went through a crisis and the people experienced very difficult living conditions. But after Putin came to power, the country got stronger. Even the international media now consider him the #1 politician in the whole world. But despite that, I think it's too early to say who will win this new superpower struggle.
When President Viktor Yanukovych fled Kiev in February after months of often violent anti-government protests, the Americans seem to have just achieved a major strategic victory over their Russian rivals.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
I wish you well. We will help you. We will help you.
Ever since the end of the Cold War, the Americans have sought to surround Russia militarily by placing bases in Eastern Europe. According to many analysts, Ukraine, on Russia's southern border, is a prize long sought after by NATO.
We are living in a time when rising nations are no longer willing to let the United States tell them what to do. Russia, China, India, Iran are all independent nations and are making alliances with each other to prevent Washington's plans to dominate us all. As long as we continue to cooperate with each other, we will all be okay.
The Americans have strong allies in Ukraine, such as the billionaire ex-Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko and the heavyweight boxer turned politician Vitaly Klitschko. And it's thought that the Americans financed at least some of the groups involved in the Maidan protests, which eventually toppled Yanukovych.
When Kiev fell, we realized that we had to protect ourselves because we know that what happens in Kiev ultimately is dictated by Washington. These hysterical, cretinous, stupid people in Kiev are just their puppets. But they have destroyed Ukraine, so we know that they can't do anything against us.
From Russia's point of view, they had to respond after, as they saw it, the West took Kiev. Russian analysts liken the toppling of Yanukovych by pro-Western ideologues to a pro-Russian armed movement taking control of Mexico or even Texas. The United States would have had no option but to respond. And respond Putin did by sending troops into the overwhelmingly pro-Russian region of Crimea and mobilizing Russia's allies there to take control of strategic facilities.
The United States views itself as the most powerful country in the world, and it seeks to dominate the whole world by getting countries and politicians to do its bidding. But it can no longer do whatever it wants to do, and it has no appetite to directly confront Russia. Putin is very clever and has a lot of allies and support amongst rising nations. He can make a lot of trouble for the West, and they know it.
In effectively annexing Crimea, Russia has established its red lines. There can be no Western military encroachment into its southern border. And Putin has gained some measure of revenge after Yanukovych's toppling. But is it a complete win-win for the Russian president, given that now he's lost any leverage he once had over Western Ukraine?
Ukraine will definitely gravitate towards the EU and NATO now. They will need a few years of accession talks before they can join NATO, and they will definitely sign the EU accession agreement that sparked this whole crisis. But ultimately, I don't think Ukraine will join NATO because that would be a red line for Russia. I think the superpowers will come to a deal, and eventually the situation will calm down.
The European Union, and indeed Ukraine, depends on Russia for gas. And Russian investment in financial centres such as London is considerable. So the Western sanctions that followed the Crimea referendum were more gesture politics than designed to truly hurt. In a nutshell, Russia got its way, and there was little the West could do about it.
the military build-up in Crimea pushes on. Armed men call the shots. Roadblocks are everywhere to prevent what they call Kiev's illegal revolution
right now,
coming
the people
here.
of Crimea are voting on whether or not to secede from Ukraine. And as we await the vote, we should keep in mind how hard it has been to get that news out.
If Crimea was a showdown between Putin and the West, then the hordes of foreign journalists in Crimea reflected that showdown. It seemed like all the world's journalists were in town as the March 16th referendum approached, and Western journalists especially were hardly the flavour of the month. While I was in Crimea, one recurring complaint from ordinary people was that the Western media was distorting the facts.
You media are a bunch of liars. You don't tell the truth about what's going on here. You can see that we are living in peace. No one is walking around with sticks trying to beat people up. We just want to live in peace and be with Russia. Why can't you just say that?
Crimea TV was just serving the interests of elites in Ukraine. It never represented the pro-Russian feeling on the streets here. And the international media, of course, will simply reflect the interests of their nations. There is no such thing as objectivity.
It was pretty obvious that much of the Western media were purely in Crimea to Russia bash. At times, they seemed to be looking for tension and violence stories, which may have been true in isolation, but didn't reflect the overall calm atmosphere in which the vote was taking place. That said, the pro-Russian authorities in Crimea did clearly make some moves to stop pro-Kiev media from operating. This channel, Black Sea TV, which is financed by pro-Western Ukrainian leader Yulia Tymoshenko's party, was one of several taken off the air. One of its star journalists agreed to be interviewed, but was clearly being guarded with her words.
There shouldn't be any such thing as pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian journalism. There should only be professional journalism. It's impossible for there to be only one point of view, but unfortunately, many channels only present one point of view, or even falsify information. I've lived through turbulent events, before like in the 90s, but now I think it's even more dangerous for independent, investigative journalists like me.
Black Sea TV broadcasts pro-Kiev and anti-Russian content. And although it admits that its owners influenced the channel, Valentina Samar told me that her own investigative program is not editorially controlled. She also said she was pessimistic about the future of journalism in Crimea.
I think the best time to be a journalist in Crimea was in the past. I do as much as I can fight for, but it isn't easy. If you're a corrupt journalist, it's still possible to work. But I'm not like that. I want to tell the truth.
So in the run-up to the referendum, the pro-Russian media clearly were in the box seat. Although many of the people I spoke to felt that this was just a reflection of the normal man's wishes. Meanwhile, the international media, despite some of their agendas, were allowed to work relatively freely. And often it was the pro-Russian authorities who actually saved them from the wrath of ordinary people. So what does the future hold for Crimea, Russia and Ukraine? We thought we'd ask the people who would actually live that reality and whose lives would be affected most by it, children and teenagers.
This is one of the oldest schools in Crimea, a lot of famous ex-pupils and ex-teachers here as well. Now, I've noticed something. There seems to be a bit of a generation gap. A lot of the older people I meet seem to be very pro-Russia, whereas the younger people buy more into the idea of Ukraine. That's a generalization, but it's true to a certain extent. What's also true is a lot of the pupils here seem to be very uncertain about the future. If Crimea joins the Russian Federation, how's that going to affect their education?
Although this school is Russian-speaking, these teenagers are doing a Ukrainian language class. We visited this school 2 days before the March 16th referendum. The children were too young to vote, but the outcome would have a profound effect on their lives.
We are all worried because we don't know what will happen after the referendum. We've been preparing for exams in Ukrainian, but now we don't know if we'll have to take them in Russian. I don't know if I can continue studying in Crimea or if I have to go to Ukraine or another country.
Maybe older people are more experienced and wise than us, but we have grown up in Ukraine, and I feel that most young people here want to stay in Ukraine.
The teachers too were uncertain about what the future held, but they were determined to avoid any social problems amongst the kids.
Of course, the situation worries me and worries everyone in the school. But whatever happens, we will continue to raise our children in the right way and teach them to the best of our ability.
Only time will tell if the situation will be better or worse, but for sure the change will affect our school. We try not to talk about politics in school because it can cause divisions, but I'm confident that there won't be any problems among the kids because Crimea is very diverse and we're used to living together in peace.
Again, I got the impression that although political and identity differences existed for sure in Crimea, they weren't big enough for serious unrest to break out. It would be a huge surprise if these kids end up fighting each other in the future. The day after the big vote, security was tight because Crimean MPs were due to leave for Moscow to formally ask to join Russia. In a ceremony with Vladimir Putin, Crimean leaders signed the accession documents. The West said the move was illegal, but most people in Russia and Crimea probably didn't care. Meanwhile, Russian forces in Crimea were making their presence more overtly felt. For the first time since I arrived, I saw Russian tanks outside Ukrainian military bases. It would be only a matter of days before all Ukrainian bases were evacuated.
The transition process for Crimea will be fast but not easy. There will be some economic problems at the start because of the blockade from Ukraine. Also, some minorities like Tatars will maybe try to create some problems, but we must make some concessions for them. And in the long term, I believe we have made the right decision to join Russia.
There won't be any war between Russia and the West because no one has the appetite for such a catastrophic military conflict. But there may be some indirect provocations by both sides. To be honest, I don't know who will win. Maybe neither side will win and China will take advantage when Russia and the US are too busy to notice.
So for now, Crimea seems reasonably safe under the Russian umbrella, and as you can see, there are Russian soldiers already on the streets here. But the question now is, will the pro-Russian eastern regions of Ukraine follow suit and also declare independence? And if that happens, what will Russia's move be? Will they support them? What will the West move be? Will NATO move to prevent that happening? So when we look back at the 2014 Crimean crisis with a few years hindsight, we may actually say that the Crimea episode was the calm prelude to a wider conflagration.